Tommy Morrison was supposed to be the next great American heavyweight. Rocky v. George Foreman, the WBO championship. A left hook that made trainers and promoters believe they had found something the division had not seen in years. And then one night in Atlantic City, one man walked into the ring and took everything away. Not just the fight, everything. Tommy Morrison came from Gravette, Arkansas. A small town, a tough upbringing. A kid who found boxing and found that boxing fit him in ways that nothing else did. The power, the aggression, the specific combination of physical gifts that made trainers stop what they were doing and pay attention. He turned professional in 1988, won the WBO heavyweight championship in 1993 by beating George Foreman, starred alongside Sylvester Stallone in Rocky v. The Duke, America's heavyweight hope, and a man who walked into Atlantic City on the 7th of October 1995 and never fully walked out. The story of Tommy Morrison and Lennox Lewis did not begin on the 7th of October 1995. It began 2 years earlier. 1993. Morrison had just beaten George Foreman, a 45-year-old Foreman, still dangerous, still carrying the power that had defined his entire career, and won the WBO heavyweight championship. He was 24 years old, undefeated in the fights that mattered. A left hook that had produced 39 knockouts across a professional career that had barely started in terms of what the boxing world believed he was capable of. Lennox Lewis was the WBC heavyweight champion. The fight between them was not just possible, it was scheduled. An $8 million purse for each man. A unification fight that would have produced the most significant heavyweight championship bout in years. Morrison versus Lewis, the Duke versus the British champion, who had won Olympic gold in Seoul in 1988 and turned professional immediately. $8 million. For Morrison, a kid from Gravette, Arkansas, who had built his career fight by fight on the regional circuit before the sport, recognized what it had. That number was not just money, it was validation. Then Michael Bentt happened. The 29th of October, 1993. Morrison chose to take a tune-up fight before the Lewis bout. The opponent was Michael Bentt, virtually unknown, considered a formality, the kind of fight that champions took to stay sharp, while the big payday waited on the other side. 97 seconds into round 1, Bentt knocked Morrison down 3 times. The fight was stopped. The WBO championship was gone. The $8 million Lewis fight was gone. $7.5 million disappeared from Morrison's future in 97 seconds because he had chosen the wrong tune-up opponent against the advice of people who knew better. Morrison sat in his locker room after the Bentt loss and felt something that would never fully leave him. Not just the competitive disappointment of losing a fight, the specific weight of understanding what that loss had cost, what the next 2 years were going to require just to get back to the position he had been in before those 97 seconds in Tulsa. He spent those 2 years doing exactly what was required. 7 fights, 6 wins, 1 draw. Building back, rebuilding the ranking, the reputation, the standing in a division that had moved on without him while he was away from its main stage. By June 1995, he had won the minor IBC heavyweight title by stopping Donovan Razor Ruddock in 6 rounds. Not the WBO, not the WBC or WBA or IBF, but a belt, a ranking, a position that put him back in conversations about title fights at the heavyweight level. And then Riddick Bowe pulled out of a scheduled fight, choosing Evander Holyfield instead, and the replacement opponent that HBO offered Morrison was Lennox Lewis. The same Lennox Lewis, 2 years later. Different circumstances. Smaller purse, $2.1 million instead of $8 million. A secondary belt at stake instead of a full unification. But the same name. The fight that had been scheduled and destroyed by Michael Bentt in 97 seconds was finally happening. Morrison said publicly that he preferred Lewis to Bowe. Said Lewis was a pretty boy. Said Lewis had no heart. said Lewis did not like to get in the trenches and take a beating, and that a man who could not take a beating was a man who could be beaten by someone willing to deliver one. The trash talk was genuine, not the manufactured kind that promoters construct to sell tickets, the specific contempt that a man develops when he has spent 2 years rebuilding toward a fight and has convinced himself across those 2 years that the man at the end of the road is beatable. Morrison believed it completely. The 7th of October, 1995, Atlantic City Convention Center, 8,369 people. Morrison's ring walk told the story before a single punch was thrown. It was described by observers as funereal. The music that accompanied it, Vangelis, Conquest of Paradise, underscored an air of gloom that his corner could not disguise regardless of how hard they tried. His trainer worked to generate energy between rounds of preparation. Morrison stood in the ring in a cut-off leather jacket and looked like a man who was performing confidence rather than feeling it. Lewis came out loose, ready, working with Emmanuel Stewart, now the same Kronk Gym legend who had trained Thomas Hearns, who had spent his career turning gifted fighters into technically complete ones. The partnership with Stewart had given Lewis something his early career had not always shown: clarity. Round 1 was conservative, both men feeling each other out. The 8,000 people in the convention center settling in for the heavyweight war they had been promised. Round 2 changed everything. Lewis landed a left hook that put Morrison on the canvas. Not a flash knockdown, not the kind of knockdown that a fighter takes and immediately rises from with his faculties intact and his game plan unaffected. A legitimate knockdown, Morrison going to one knee, the cut opening at the corner of his right eye from the impact, the referee counting over him while the Atlantic City crowd processed what they were watching. Morrison got up, but the eye was already becoming a problem. Round 3. Morrison tried to get inside, tried to close distance and make the fight the kind of close physical exchange that his style demanded and that Lewis's longer reach made difficult to establish. Lewis met him with a jab that snapped his head back and kept him at the range where the left hand could do maximum damage. The eye continued swelling. Round 4. The swelling was visible from the arena seats. Morrison's right eye closing, reducing his field of vision, eliminating the peripheral awareness that elite fighters depend on to read combinations and manage distance. He was fighting half-blind, and Lewis showed no mercy. Round 5. Another knockdown. Morrison down again, getting up, still willing, still carrying the specific toughness that had brought him from Gravette, Arkansas, to a heavyweight title fight on HBO, the refusal to accept that being hurt was a reason to stop. But the will that carried him to his feet could not replace the vision he had lost. Round 6. 2 more knockdowns. 4 total across 6 rounds. Morrison's eyes glazed, one swollen nearly shut, his face bloody, his legs carrying him upright through something that had stopped resembling competitive boxing somewhere in the middle rounds and had become something else entirely. Referee Mills Lane looked at Tommy Morrison and made the only decision available to him. 1 minute and 34 seconds into round 6. Technical knockout, Lewis. Morrison sat in the locker room after the fight. His face told the story that his words could not fully tell. The swollen eye, the cuts, the specific damage that 6 rounds of Lennox Lewis's jab produced on a face that had absorbed heavyweight punishment across 47 professional fights without ever looking quite like this. He made jokes. That was Tommy Morrison's way. The humor that a proud man from Arkansas deploys when the alternative, sitting in silence with the full weight of what had just happened, is not something he is prepared to do in front of cameras. He said if he had practiced sparring with a patch over his eye, he would have kicked Lewis's ass. He said when asked how to beat Lewis, kick him straight in the balls. The boxing world laughed, and then the cameras left, and Morrison sat alone with something that jokes could not reach. The hatred did not begin the night of the fight. It had been building for 2 years. Since the Michael Bentt loss in 1993, Since the 97 seconds that had taken the $8 million Lewis fight and replaced it with 2 years of rebuilding on the regional circuit against opponents that the heavyweight division's main stage had never heard of. Morrison had spent those 2 years telling himself a story. The story went like this. Bentt was a fluke. The tune-up gone wrong. The one bad night that every fighter was entitled to, the night where circumstances combined in the wrong way and produced a result that the competitive reality between the two men did not actually reflect. Morrison was better than Bentt. Would beat Bentt 9 times out of 10 if they fought again. The 97 seconds were an aberration. And Lewis, the fight that had been taken away by that aberration, was beatable. More than beatable. Morrison had watched Lewis, had studied him across the 2 years of rebuilding, had identified what he believed were the specific vulnerabilities that his own style, the aggression, the left hook, the willingness to take punishment, to deliver punishment, could exploit in a man whose career had already shown that pressure and physical intensity could make him uncomfortable. The Oliver McCall fight in 1994 had confirmed it. McCall had knocked Lewis out in 2 rounds, had walked straight at him and thrown the overhand right that landed when Lewis's hands were low and his guard was momentarily open. A 29-1 underdog who had destroyed the WBC heavyweight champion in front of the world. Morrison saw that fight and believed it contained the blueprint. Pressure, aggression. Make Lewis uncomfortable. Make him feel the kind of close-quarters violence that the McCall result suggested he could not handle. He had been wrong. Not about McCall. The blueprint was real. McCall had found something genuine. But Morrison had made the mistake that fighters sometimes make when they study an opponent's vulnerability without fully accounting for what the opponent had done to address it. Lewis had spent the year between McCall and the Morrison fight working with Emanuel Stewart. Stewart had fixed the specific technical problems that McCall had exposed, had drilled the jab already, one of the best in the heavyweight division, into something even more precise and more controlling, had worked the footwork and the head movement and the specific defensive adjustments that prevented the close-quarters exchanges that had made the McCall result possible. Morrison walked into the ring on October 7 expecting to find the pre-Stewart Lewis. He found someone else. And by the time he understood the difference, by the time the evidence had accumulated across 2 rounds of being unable to establish the inside position, his style required, the eye was already swelling, and the window for the kind of fight Morrison needed was already closing. The aftermath settled into something permanent. 4 months after the Lewis fight, February 1996, Morrison tested positive for HIV. The Nevada State Athletic Commission revoked his license. Boxing commissions around the world followed. The career that had survived Michael Bentt, had rebuilt across 2 years, had taken the Lewis fight and lost, was over. Not from the loss itself. Losses happened. Fighters rebuilt from losses had done it before and would do it again. Morrison had rebuilt from Bentt, had shown the competitive spirit and the work ethic to climb back from a 97-second catastrophe to a major HBO fight against a former world champion. He could have rebuilt from Lewis. The HIV diagnosis removed that possibility. And the connection in Morrison's mind, in the accounting of how his career had ended, ran directly from Lewis back through those 2 years to the night Bentt had stolen the first Lewis fight and set in motion everything that followed. If Bentt had not happened, the first Lewis fight would have happened in 1993, a different version of that fight, Morrison younger, Morrison with more options. Morrison, before the 2 years of rebuilding, had taken their toll on what he was physically and psychologically. Maybe the same result. Maybe not. That question, the one with no answer, was what the hatred lived inside, not a clear grievance. Not a specific moment where Lewis had done something outside the rules or beyond the boundaries of what professional boxing permitted. Lewis had won a fight, had won it completely and convincingly, and without anything that Morrison could point to as unfair or illegitimate. But the fight had ended a career, had been the last serious heavyweight contest of Tommy Morrison's life, had been followed 4 months later by the diagnosis that closed every door the sport might have left open. And the man standing at the center of that ending, the man whose jab had controlled 6 rounds and whose combinations had produced 4 knockdowns, and whose win had been the last meaningful result of Morrison's professional life, was Lennox Lewis. Morrison made a brief comeback in 2007, 11 years after the HIV diagnosis, a period during which he had denied the diagnosis publicly, had said repeatedly that he did not have HIV, that the tests had been wrong, that he was healthy, and had been falsely removed from a sport he had a right to compete in. The Nevada Commission lifted the suspension. He fought twice, won both, and then stopped again. He died on the 1st of September 2013, 44 years old. The official cause of death was listed as complications from encephalopathy, neurological damage. The HIV that he had denied for 17 years had done what the disease does when it is not properly treated across the years it is denied. The boxing world paused briefly, remembered Rocky V, remembered the left hook, remembered the WBO title won over George Foreman and the career that should have been built on that foundation, and remembered October 7, 1995, the night in Atlantic City that ended the serious chapter of Tommy Morrison's career. The 6 rounds that produced 4 knockdowns and 1 swollen eye and 1 funereal ring walk's worth of a story that the jokes in the locker room afterward could not fully cover. Lennox Lewis moved on from that night immediately, won the WBC title from Frank Bruno in his next fight, beat Evander Holyfield, beat Mike Tyson, built a heavyweight legacy that the sport placed among the greatest of its era. Tommy Morrison never moved on from the 7th of October 1995. Could not, because the fight had not just been a loss. It had been the door closing on everything that came before it and everything that might have come after. Lewis walked through that door and into a championship legacy. Morrison stood on the other side of it. For the rest of his life, Tommy Morrison gave boxing everything he had: the power, the hunger, the willingness to stand in front of the hardest punchers alive and refuse to move backward. He deserved a longer story than the one he got. But one night in Atlantic City wrote the ending before the middle chapters had finished, and the man who wrote it never looked back. Stay here. More stories like this are coming.